Good evening, everyone. Sorry, we're about a minute late getting started. Technical difficulties, of course. You would think 4 years into the pandemic that Zoom would be getting easier, but it seems to get more complicated on an annual basis. So thanks for being patient. Just going to give it a second to get everybody into the room, and then we will get going. All right, so good evening. I'm Kelley Challen. I'm the Director of Transition Services at NESCA, and I oversee our post-secondary transition consultation, planning, and assessment services. I've been at NESCA since 2013, almost 11 years, but I have been engaged in evaluation, development, and direction of transition-focused programming for teenagers and young adults with a wide array of developmental and learning abilities since 2004. So this is clearly an area of interest and passion for me. If you're unfamiliar with NESCA, I just wanted to take a moment to talk about our practice. We're a group practice with offices in Newton, Plainville, and Hingham, Massachusetts, as well as Londonderry, New Hampshire. And we have satellite staff in Burlington, Vermont, and Brooklyn, New York. We specialize in assessment, treatment, and consultation services for children, adolescents, and young adults with special needs, whether mild or complex. And our clinical staff is comprised of 13 expert neuropsychologists and 4 transition specialists. Our transition specialists have a mix of backgrounds in school and guidance counseling, occupational therapy, and vocational rehabilitation counseling. We also have on staff therapists, psychoeducational counselors, occupational therapists, speech language pathologists, special educators, and consultants. NESCA was founded in 2007 as a neuropsychology practice, but we've had transition specialists on staff and offered transition services since 2009, essentially since the beginning of the practice. This means that thinking about transition planning is really ingrained into our practice, and each of our clinicians aims to provide thorough and accurate testing that can support a family and team in creating a roadmap for helping a child progress toward adult life. That's a lot of information about NESCA and us. If you can, just take a minute and type into the chat, and just let me know a little bit of information about yourself, whether you're a parent or educator or other professional. If you are a parent or professional, maybe type in the age of how old student is or how old the students are that you tend to work with, just so I can get a sense of who's in the virtual room here. And if the chat's not working on your end and you want to type anything into the Q&A instead, that's fine. All right, I see parent. Great. Definitely some parents. And some folks working at schools as well. This is awesome. And we have someone in the audience who is 2 papers away from becoming a transition specialist, which is really cool. That is the first time in 10 years of giving presentations that I've ever had somebody who was on the verge of becoming a transition specialist in the audience. Very exciting. So we have a really nice kind of range of audience members, and I'm going to try to make sure that I'm speaking to provide information that's going to be useful for everyone. So here's what I'm going to try to do tonight. We have until about 8:30. Going to go through some definitions of transition, touch upon why transition planning needs to begin early. And then I'm going to spend quite a bit of time discussing the skills and variables that make a real difference in successful transition planning. I'm hoping to leave about 20 or maybe even 25 minutes for questions at the end of the presentation. So I'm going to ask that you just understand that I'm not going to look at many of the questions until the end. And hopefully that will work out for you. You can feel free to type things into the Q&A as we go. And then we'll just look at those at the end of the presentation. So thank you so much for being patient about that. So what is transition? You know, it's a word that we hear a lot about. It has a lot of different meanings as well, especially in current day and age. But what does it mean? What are we talking about in the context of post-secondary transition? So we might look at Merriam-Webster for a definition, right? We might think about passage from one state, stage, subject, or place to another. A movement or development or evolution from one form, stage, or style to another. That's definitely part of what's going on with transition. Or we can consider this definition that comes from Andrew Halpern. Says that transition refers to a change in status from behaving primarily as a student to assuming emergent adult roles in the community, right? So this is a pretty progressive change because we're shifting a lot of different variables. However, for students on IEPs, transition does have additional implications. Transition services are a legal term and concept defined in the federal law. So if you have a child on an IEP or work with children on IEPs or are endeavoring to work with children on IEPs, you're probably familiar with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 2004, right? We hear a lot about IDEA. And IDEA ensures students with disabilities throughout the country have the right to a free, appropriate public education, FAPE. But the other thing that this federal law mandates is that the purpose of special education and related services is to meet the unique needs of students with disabilities and to prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. So the purpose of providing students with free appropriate public education across the United States is to make sure that students are prepared for further education, for employment, and for independent living. That's really the goal of what we're trying to do for all of these children. One of the primary ways that special education prepares students with disabilities for these post-secondary activities is the provision of transition services. And transition services are described and defined in IDEA. Within the definition of the IEP, the law states that no later than age 16, it's 14 in Massachusetts, it's 14 in a number of other states, and it's even 12 in one state in the United States. But no later than age 16, every student in the United States on an IEP, that IEP must include appropriate measurable post-secondary goals. So those are post-high school goals that are based on age-appropriate transition assessments related to training, education, employment, and where appropriate independent living skills. And so every IEP, we have to have done transition assessment and we have to have come up with measurable post-secondary goals, and they need to be listed in the IEP. And it says where appropriate independent living skills. And the only way to figure out if that's appropriate is to make sure we've done assessment in that area as well, right? So we have to have goals for after high school in the IEP. And then we have to have the transition services, including courses of study that are needed to assist the child in reaching those goals. Transition services are defined in IDEA as a coordinated set of activities that's designed to be within a results-oriented process that is focused on improving the academic and functional achievement of the child with a disability to facilitate the child's movement from school to post-school activities, including post-secondary education, vocational education, integrated employment. So we are never aiming for anything less than integrated employment, even if a student needs supports. And continuing in adult education, adult services, independent living, or community participation. And this coordinated set of transition activities is based on the child's needs, but also takes into account the child's strengths, preferences, and interests. This makes transition services different than some other conversations that we might have in special education. Often we're really focused on remediation of disability-related needs. With transition planning, we are still focused on that, but we're taking into account this kid's strengths and their preferences and their interests. And we're really building towards their goals for after high school. And transition services includes instruction, general ed, specialized instruction, also related services, community experiences, the development of employment and other post-school adult living objectives, and if appropriate, acquisition of daily living skills and functional vocational evaluation. So transition services are pretty broad, but we can sort of simplify them, right? We want to make sure that we're thinking about strengths, preferences, interests, and needs. We want to have expectations that students are participating in the process, that transition assessment will be happening, that there are measurable post-secondary goals in every IEP. So we can look somewhere in the IEP and know what we're all trying to help this student accomplish. And that there's annual goals and services that are going to support progress towards those measurable post-secondary goals. We look at 4 areas: post-secondary education and training, employment, independent living, community involvement. And we're thinking about 4 concepts. It's a vision-driven process. It's results-oriented, it's coordinated, and it's both academic and functional. IEP transition planning is a cyclical process. It's how we engage the student, and it's how we empower the student. Goal setting is about how you identify and write the goal. Goal setting should always be informed by transition assessment. Once we have post-secondary goals, we create an action plan for progressing toward those goals. We execute the plan through annual goals and annual transition services, and we evaluate progress or adjust our goals and plan. So I say rinse and repeat, right? We're doing this throughout the students' participation in special education. However, transition planning goes beyond the IEP. It requires a durable mindset of optimism and a great deal of creativity and flexibility. A lot of creativity. It's one of the reasons I actually really enjoy this type of work. We move slowly and we take opportunities one at a time, often in an unexpected order. It truly is a marathon, and you really do need a village. So during school, this includes members of the school community and the local community who are not just special educators, related professionals, and adults who are paid to be part of the students' team. It's really critical that what we're building toward is a village that's going to last beyond the walls of education. Good news, have you started transition planning, or have the students you're working with started transition planning? Of course, this is something that starts at birth, right? Every time we make a conscious decision to teach a child a skill, or if we're lucky, the times when kids assert themselves and say, I want to do it myself. I think it can be incredibly frustrating. I mean, I know it can be incredibly frustrating as a parent, right? You're on the way out the door. You have 5 things, that you're late for, and somebody wants to put on a shoe and they don't quite have the skills yet to do it quickly enough, right? But there's that choice there. And the more that we can empower young people when they express an interest in doing something, to be able to have the time to do it, for us to be able to have the patience, find the times when it's more convenient if we can. But it's just really important to make sure that we're sort of consciously helping to build these skills. I know I parent a 7-year-old and an 11-year-old boy. Can be a struggle sometimes to help them build independence. It often takes time we don't have, but I try to think of things that we can gradually do to build skills, self-care skills, domestic skills. We're working on toothbrushing thoroughly, 2 front teeth, having context clues for how you've done that thoroughly. I like going to Trader Joe's because they have tiny shopping carts, which are great for kids to be able to practice, moving their bodies around space independently, finding items that they like, figuring out how to put those up on the counter when they get through. I try to get kids to help with laundry, emptying silverware, animal care. And I think one of the things that I really try to do, and I know this is not successful all the time, but is, especially with my older son, if he asks me for help, which he does a lot, I try to offer to do the task with him as opposed to for him, right? It's just sort of reframing that mentality of why is help needed? What's the skill that's missing? Is this a confidence thing? But really just trying to pass more and more skills that direction, because this is a long process, but we've certainly all started, and we can kind of keep working on it. Why do we begin early? Lots of reasons. Certainly planning for a smooth transition takes time. And right now this process is taking longer for all students. So I really think depending on what kind of workplace you're in, if you happen to be in a workplace that has anybody who's in their late 20s or even early 30s, a lot of young adults in the current economy still live with their parents, right? So we're living in a day and age when transition, to these emerging adult roles takes longer. But also, learning does take longer for students with disabilities, and there are often fewer opportunities for our students with special needs to learn adulting skills, right? They're not given as many opportunities. We do need to prioritize one skill at a time, right? We need to practice many times and across settings and contexts, not just at home and school. At NESCA, we often talk about building skills until they're automatic, right? Doing it so many times that you don't even need to think about it. And transition from high school to adult life increases stress and anxiety and novelty. And if we can reduce basic skill development needs, we leave room for new and more challenging tasks. Also, many of the students that we're talking about need more explicit instruction. And we might be partway through teaching one skill and realize we need to teach something else that we thought was already understood or learned. So it's just a real mentality that we need to adopt, that we're always transition planning, right? We're always transitioning students. We also want to set the tone and growth mindset before adolescence if possible. And I'm sure some people are on here thinking, but my kid's already an adolescent or students are already 15. Unfortunately, it's completely developmentally appropriate for students to have no interest in listening to or learning from their parents when they are teenagers, right? That's actually a normative teenage thing, to not want any help from your parents and not want to listen to them. So the earlier we can start this process of learning these skills, being willing to help with things, the better. And then if you've already got teenagers, sometimes you do have to pull in additional helpers that they will listen to. And then I also just like to mention financial and legal planning takes time too. And part of the financial planning that takes a long time is planning for housing in adulthood. So the more you can learn about this process early and really think about and be visioning and other things, the better. Why else is transition planning important? We know from longitudinal studies that youth who are on IEPs are less likely to take a college entrance or placement exam, right? I know there are a lot of test optional schools in the world, but students on IEPs should get to sit for tests just as often as their non-disabled peers, right? And at least see how they do, where they stand. Students on IEPs are less likely to take a high school course for college credit, less likely to have those early college experiences. They're less likely to have a job for pay as a high school student. And they're less likely to expect that they can attend college or that they can attend on their own. Other things that we know from research, we can see that young adults who've been on IEPs are more likely to attend two-year colleges. So maybe we're shooting lower or at a different entry point. They're less likely to finish at four-year colleges. They often earn an average of $1 less per hour. They're less likely to live independently, and they're less likely to have a checking account or a credit card, right? So what we know is we're not teaching the same things to our students on IEPs. One of the other things I often share is that more than 75% of adults with developmental disabilities live at home with their families. And nationwide, at least 25% of those caregivers that are taking care of adults are age 60 or older, right? So we just really need to think about planning for students as early as we can. So it's clear that we need to be setting the bar high and doing our best. And if we're going to put time and energy into skill building, we need to know what makes the biggest difference. And there's 7 skills that I want to talk about this evening that have been highlighted as having a significant impact on student success and satisfaction, specifically for students who've been on IEPs and then make a transition to college or a transition to adulthood in general. So the things we're going to talk about are self-awareness, goal setting, perseverance, use of available resources, emotional coping strategies, self-determination, and meaningful employment. I cannot emphasize enough that students need to be able to report accurate information regarding their strengths and disabilities and to express the types of accommodations they need for success. Special education is a wonderful process, but it also doesn't mirror anything else that that students are going to encounter in their adult lives. Because there's this mandate that schools are going to find our kids and provide them with the help that they need. But in any other environment, people are not seeking you out to provide you with the help you need, especially if you don't look like you need help, or you have a really, sort of a lower incidence disability and nobody knows what kind of help you need, right? So students need to be aware of their strengths and the things they like to do, and they also need to be aware of their limitations, and they need to use self-awareness to guide their decision making. And this starts with being able to explain the special education services that they receive, right? Like having an understanding of what I'm getting and what helps me to get through my day and how to talk about that with other people. And I say talk about, but I mean how to share that information, because maybe I'm sharing it in a picture form, or maybe I'm sharing it in a video that I've made, right? But I need to have a way to do that. There are a lot of different aspects of self-awareness, and any one of these could be a starting point for a conversation at home for self-exploration. Could also be an IEP objective for a student who's not yet transition aged, or an IEP objective for a student who is, right? So some students have a really hard time figuring out what they like, but they can tell you what they don't like. um, sometimes they can tell you things they do like and enjoy doing, right? Or what do I learn well? What comes easily to me? What makes me feel proud? I love asking students, tell me about a success or a time you felt really proud, or a time you accomplished something, a time you felt good about yourself, time you did something you didn't think you could do, right? Personality, things that challenge you or take more work, people who help you overcome challenges, supports that help you overcome challenges, and just having an understanding of like where I am when I can learn things well, right? Or how information's being given to me, that's easier for me to learn. Do I have teachers that are just easier to learn from? Why, right? Like just you can start a lot of different places with self-awareness, but it's such an important set of skills. And then certainly disclosure is a really important aspect of self-awareness. Some things to consider related to disability disclosure, include there's no magic age. You need to keep development and readiness in mind. What I know working with a lot of providers who work with adults with a wide range of disabilities is that for the most part, we work on disclosure later than we should, right? So there's no magic age, but I think also really thinking about what students are developmentally ready for, and there's usually something they're ready for, and getting going on this when you can is important. Diagnostic label versus descriptive information, right? You might not need to know a specific technical diagnosis, but if you can start by understanding, how different parts of your brain work, or what things come easier, or I have a really hard time paying attention to stuff that isn't a special interest for me, right? You can start learning some language, which ends up being way more important to disclose than labels. And then you can explain that, hey, these 3 pieces of language, actually, there's a name for that, right? It's important to recognize impact and try not to minimize. And also think of this as a process, learning, growing, changing, and acceptance over a lifetime. You can use books, internet, TV resources. We have so many, so many more resources coming out all the time, so much on the internet now. Obviously, you want to pay attention to that and sort of organize it. But there's a lot of good stuff to be able to use for helping to build real awareness around disability. Certainly discussing brain development and function, also being honest and asking other people to give honest input to the student. You know, if a student's just really smelly, walking around the world really smelly every day in a lot of different environments, and maybe you tell them at home that they stink, but then they say, well, no one else has told me that. You know, it's like, call the teacher, call the guidance counselor, call, you know, call the sports coach, call somebody and see if someone can help provide some honest feedback so that we can create some motivation to actually be working on skills, right? The other thing, you know, to consider when talking about learning about self, learning style, interpersonal style, organizational style. I mean, again, there's so many cool tools. There's crazy quizzes that exist on the internet and social media, and you could take them as a whole family, right? Or take them as a whole class and then kind of just compare and contrast how people got different results and why you think you got that, right? I mean, everybody's brain style preferences are all different. And the more that we can just kind of like acknowledge and appreciate that, the easier it is to look at disability as a natural part of the human experience, which it is. Also relating or comparing strengths and challenges to known people, family members, TV or book characters. You can use division of labor at home to highlight strengths and challenges, right? Division of labor in a school system. Involve in a feedback discussion. I guess I don't want to say this too quickly. I think it's really important to involve students in feedback discussions with a psychologist or a counselor or a special education teacher about assessment information. If a student participates in testing, they have a right to know some of those results. And that may or may not mean knowing an exact diagnosis, but certainly knowing what are some of the things that were learned, right? You know, I don't need to necessarily know all my percentiles as a 7-year-old, but it's helpful to know, you know, if I'm better with words than I am with pictures, right? So I think really helping students to understand as much as they can about tests that are about them is really important. In addition to self-awareness, goal setting is a critical transition skill. Students need to be able to name specific and realistic goals, conceive a way to measure the goal, determine strategy and a step-by-step process that's necessary, you know, for moving toward that goal, develop a timeline, right? Take step towards completing the goal, assess their progress and completion. How complete is it? And then adjust as needed. And students can certainly participate in systematic learning of goal setting and attainment, and build an understanding of the importance of setting and striving for goals. But goal setting is not just about the IEP process, right? Students can learn goal setting through plenty of at-home or extracurricular activities. Reading a book, setting goals for myself, you know, how many pages I'm going to read tonight, or how many minutes I'm going to read tonight, or how many pages I'm going to read in how many minutes, right? Completing an art project, planning a party or a trip, planning, you know, a day trip for a vacation week, preparing a family meal, or just preparing my own breakfast, saving allowance, writing thank you notes. Remembering medications, right? Like learning to use a pill organizer. I mean, there's so many different types of goals that students can work on. Let them choose some goals that are important to them. There are plenty of like free life skills kinds of checklists. I mean, goals don't have to be life skills, but oftentimes that's a good place to start. There's plenty of life skills checklists on the internet. There's a life skills inventory from Washington State. Sometimes you can find this like adolescent autonomy checklist, which I know is for adolescents. So we're talking about younger kids, but you know, even just looking for like life skills checklist for elementary school student, right? Like find a checklist, talk to a student, see what they might be most interested in learning. I often try to work with students around first, like, how do you think you're doing with some of these things? How important do you think it is for adults to do these things? Or for, you know, if I've got an elementary school student, like how important do you think it will be in middle school to do X or Y or Z? And if I find the things they think are going to be important in middle school, then like, is there anything you want to work on and set goals towards now? In addition to goal setting, perseverance, right? I set a goal, but can I actually stick to it? Perseverance is a really important skill set. And it has to do with, knowing when to back up, change course, ask for help, being persistent to a point. It has to do with being flexible and adaptable, having the ability to adopt new strategies and redefine goals, and accepting and learning from failures, right? You have to be able to cope with failure to be somebody who can persevere. Develops through other people explicitly modeling grit. I think sometimes as adults, we don't show the kids around us like when we failed, when we made a mistake, when we're having a hard time. But students noticing, hey, I tried this, it didn't work, I'm going to try this a different way, is an important way of them seeing us persevering, us modeling grit, and not just assuming that everything, is learned the first time it's tried, right? Sometimes there's also that like growth mindset, right? Talking about when we're practicing something versus when we actually need to demonstrate it. And so sometimes language can help with perseverance, but also, practicing things with support. If I know there's support there first, I might be able to work just a little bit harder. Making a logical connection between actions and motivators, right? Here's what you're doing. Here's what's motivating for you. Here's how that's going to result in something you want, right? Believing you can achieve success and others supporting that belief, and risk taking. I think it's so important to understand that when we are over accommodating, or when we are knocking down barriers for students, or just enabling students to go around risks and avoid failures, we're really we're taking away opportunities to build this skill of perseverance, right? I led a support group for parents of transition age students years ago now, but I remember the story always sticks in my head. It was a parent that was sharing a story, taking her 12-year-old to the supermarket, leaving him at the butcher with the instruction of getting half pound of turkey. It's something they'd done together, many times. And he was supposed to get the turkey and meet her at the front of the store. And then 5 minutes and then 10 minutes went by, and he did not meet her at the front of the store. And when she went back to the butcher, he was standing there, pretty paralyzed, like almost a panic attack, because the butcher had asked how thick a slice of turkey he wanted. And he wasn't expecting it, and he didn't know the answer, and he froze. And obviously anxiety was, something that was a struggle for this kid. So she felt so guilty for putting him in that situation. She never asked him to get turkey again. And I think what's so hard about helping students to build perseverance is that we also have to be able to cope, right? Like we have to be able to cope with watching students fail. We have to be able to cope with watching students struggle. We have to be able to let them take risks and even co-regulate with them at times when things go awry, right? So, but this is a critical skill set. Use of available resources has to do with the presence and use of effective support systems. So it requires knowing that you need help, knowing what help is available, being able to ask for the right kind of help. If we think about students who are going to make a transition to college, just as an example, it can look like, being able to maintain at least one friend, successfully participating in small groups to complete projects, successfully participating in community organizations like sports clubs or social groups, or music group on campus, successfully interacting with peers and teachers and other adults on the campus, and then, comfortably using necessary supports. So if a student needs accommodations, they have to be able to use disability support services or student accessibility services or whatever that office is called on their campus. And they might need to be able to use tutoring or a writing center. But students absolutely need to know what they need and how to get it. It's not about waiting around and hoping for help to come, but it's about seeking support from other individuals. And it builds upon the self-awareness and self-advocacy that we've talked about before. And it's really important to have the right support community. So the other piece of this is students being able to recognize the difference between individuals who provide a positive source of support from those who don't, and identifying situations when positive support people are needed, using help from positive support people only when needed and necessary, and also maintaining a support network. And so being able to show appreciation or reciprocity to others, right? Being somebody who people will want to help because you were grateful and you were appreciative. Those things matter. Students also need to develop effective means of reducing and coping with stress and frustration and other emotional aspects of having a neurodivergent profile, right? So just like goal setting, coping strategies develop when students are allowed to take risks. But also, some students need explicit social emotional learning, right? I do think, it's really important. This isn't on this slide, but healthy lifestyle habits are a really big part of coping strategies. And I think technology has certainly added a big challenge to teaching students to appreciate things like sleep and exercise and healthy eating. But we know that those three basic healthy lifestyle habits are a really important part of coping, right? An important part of our emotional well-being. The other thing that can be really important, again, is that sort of explicit social emotional learning, right? Like being taught and having the opportunity to practice the coping strategies that are going to be most effective for me. And sometimes those are body-based, right? Some students don't do well with just talking. They need something body-based to do. Sometimes they do well with talking or learning positive self-talk or other things. But no matter what coping strategies a student is learning to build, if a student's learning some coping techniques in a private therapy or in school-based counseling or in a mindfulness class, they have to be able to generalize those coping strategies to real world situations, right? So we want to make sure that those skills are generalizing, that we're providing opportunities or objectives to make sure that students are generalizing these skills. The second to last skill we're going to talk about is self-determination, but this is definitely one of the most important skills, and it builds from many of the other described skills. So this slide includes two definitions of self-determination that both come from fact sheets put together by the Division on Career Development and Transition from the Council for Exceptional Children. So it's DCDT. And the first is the most current, but I like them both. So self-determination is the ability to make choices, solve problems, set goals, evaluate options, take initiative to reach one's goals, and accept consequences of one's actions. And then I think the second one's a little easier to remember. Self-determination is essentially being able to make choices and decisions about one's life without any more support than necessary, right? And that's really what we're aiming for. It's not this like full independence. There's a little bit of interdependence here, but it's being able to make the choices and decisions without more support than you truly need. And, when students are self-determined, they have a sense of control and a belief that they can affect the outcome of their life. They assume more responsibility for actions and outcomes, right? If they have more of an internal locus of control, they feel more responsible for how they're acting and how things are happening in their lives. And they're more proactive. Students who are more self-determined are more proactive politically, economically, they're more socially involved. They're sort of more qualitatively involved in their communities. Research has absolutely indicated that individuals who have higher levels of self-determination have better employment outcomes, including higher wages. Research also indicates that individuals who have higher levels of self-determination have a better quality of life, greater levels of independence, productivity, community integration, and satisfaction. And something else that's nice to know is that when students have more self-determination as high school students, as middle school students, they have more positive experiences during school, better grades, better attendance, better behavior. So students who are more self-determined are actually, a little bit more pleasant to be around, right? They're often sort of more proactively engaged in the school environment. We should be striving for this for all students. Self-determination develops when students have frequent opportunities for choice making, problem solving, and goal setting. The other way that self-determination can develop is participation in the IEP process. It's an evidence-based way to help students build self-determination skills. And when we keep students away from IEP meetings, we're actively delaying those students being able to advocate for themselves in meaningful ways in adult life. And sometimes students are not involved in IEP teams because we have team dynamics that are uncomfortable, and we're worried about exposing the student to that. And I think, if for some reason we've developed some uncomfortable patterns on a team that are preventing the student from being part of the team, those things need to be addressed and changed. It's not an excuse for the student not to be involved because we as adults can't make it a safe space, right? Students need to be taught about how to be part of an IEP, but sometimes there's also staff or parent training that makes student participation challenging. One of the things that I always think is just so important, by middle or high school, especially if things are a little sticky in meetings, is invite people to team meetings who aren't usually part of the team. Figure out who the kid likes that they would feel more comfortable having be part of that team process, and make it a bigger team, a more enjoyable team, right? Like break the pattern by changing up who's part of the process. That can be really important. I also want to mention employment because that's a predictor of success as well. Some of the following behaviors in high school that relate to post-school employment and education are things like expressing the desire for a job that matches career interests, demonstrating job readiness skills like being on time, completing work that's assigned, working cooperatively, successfully participating in a career technology or job training program, and having a paid job. As much as humanly possible, we should be striving for all students to have some form of paid work while they're still secondary students. Summer is often a great time to do that, but it can be a really small, very part-time job after school or on the weekend. But really being able to, do work that people would pay you for, where you're meeting somebody else's expectations, we know is really predictive of future success. And soft skills also matter. This is just kind of a grouping of skills, teamwork, collaboration, enthusiasm, health and wellness choices, right? Work ethic, professionalism. A lot of these things also have an impact on students being successful. So I've shared some ways to work on these skills. And there are a few other points I like to mention, and I say a few, but I feel like my list of other things that I want people to think about gets a little bit longer. And I don't want it to be overwhelming, but I like to share the important stuff. So, certainly vision drives everything. Last week was National Down Syndrome, I guess it was International Down Syndrome Day, not just national. But if you saw anywhere on the internet the Assume That I Can video that Core Down distributed, it was a really powerful video. And the message was basically, assume that I can, and maybe I will, right? If you haven't seen the video, please Google it. We really need to be creating a narrative of I can and I will. There's a lot of research that indicates that outcomes are very possible for students that I'm just not seeing, attained on a regular basis. For a lot of students who've been on IEPs, I think we sometimes are setting standards lower when research tells us that lots and lots of students can live on their own, can work, can have friendships, can have romantic relationships, can learn to drive, even if they don't learn to drive till they're 40. There's just so many things that students can do. So we need to really create the narrative of expectation and possibility. Let the students set the goals, refer to it often, and as much as possible, have this become more and more that the student's in the driver's seat, and keep things as strength-based as we can. This is a visioning tool that I sometimes use, although there's a lot of different ones out there. And certainly a child, may not be able to fill in every piece of this graphic, but they might be able to fill in one piece, and that can create motivation. And over time, we need to work to help students fill in the whole picture. and make the picture sort of make sense. It doesn't have to make sense initially, but what we do is we set up, conversations and experiences and services and other things to help students better make a complete picture that makes sense, right? So I had a student I was working with who wanted to live in Los Angeles and also really wanted to be a film editor. And I think when you think you want to be in the film industry, you assume you want to live in LA, but a lot of post-production for film doesn't happen in California. Some of the states in the United States that give the biggest incentives for film production are Oklahoma, Illinois, and Kentucky. And a lot of post-production happens in other countries, right? It's all about sort of who's going to give incentives, and tax breaks and other things. And so those two pieces of information weren't going to go together. And for that student, as they did more career development, it had to become a priority of like, do I really want to live in California? Or do I really want to be a film editor, right? So we let students name the vision, but we use transition planning to help students learn about their goals and the steps they might need to take toward those goals and revise those goals over time, right? They're in the driver's seat, but they're sort of where they're driving gets more narrow over time. As I mentioned, IEP participation is really critical. This often starts at home. IEP participation is a great opportunity for self-awareness and self-determination and self-advocacy to all become fully integrated. Students learn about their strengths, their disability-related needs, and why they have accommodations. They practice goal setting. We do so much goal setting as part of an IEP process, right? And they practice advocating for their vision in front of a group of people. And we also have to think about things like measurable and steps for achieving goals as part of the process. So much about the process just fits naturally with developing self-determination skills. And unfortunately, even though research shows that student-led IEPs are highly effective, we're just not used to adopting this yet on a global level. So a lot of times parents and school staff are not prepared for this participation, right? Parents and educators really need to work together ahead of time to set the stage when we're going to start involving students in the process. Right now, research shows that, typically whoever's leading the team meeting talks for the most number of minutes in a team meeting. Students speak the least, parents speak the second least. And we have to kind of practice and reframe how the meetings run if we want students to be active participants in this. This slide just describes a step-by-step way to include students in the process. So, first it can be students learning about their rights and what happens in an IEP process. What does an IEP look like? A student might just be sitting in the room, but it's agreed on that the student's just going to sit in the room. Like that's what they want to do, right? They might review more about their IEP, their specific IEP with a parent or with a professional or with a couple of people. They might prepare a script to be able to talk at their team meeting. They might then develop a bigger PowerPoint presentation or brochure, and then over time they might learn to lead parts of the meeting or the whole meeting. And as we said, if a student, can't be present in the meeting, you could think about something else. Maybe they could do, mini team meeting before a whole team meeting or meet with just some team members. But certainly students need to know that their voice matters in this process. This is another visual. It's a brochure that can be used for helping to first encourage students to be involved in their IEP process and to increase involvement over time. It comes from iamdetermined.org, which is a project out of Virginia, and they have a lot of different resources, videos, questionnaires and things, sample IEPs, just to help students see something that's a little bit easier to digest. So it's a great website for thinking about student engagement. And then in addition to IEP participation, one of the things we do need to do over time is make efforts to minimize accommodations across settings. And I think this is hard because as students sort of get into their educational journey, a lot of times, things may be understood about a student at a certain time. So we may be like increasing supports. And maybe a student's just getting like one-to-one aid support as a fourth or fifth grader, as a middle schooler. And so we're resistant to reducing that accommodation because it just got there or, it feels really important. But the reality is one-to-one support after high school isn't an accommodation that exists in the real world. Students who want to be allowed access to the community or to a work site in adult life need to be able to function at least a 1-to-4, a 1-to-5 ratio. So some of the things that we consider to be accommodations as part of our special education process, they're not accommodations once you leave schools, and we really need to be sort of minimizing as soon as we can, where we can, right? And thinking about whether something's really an accommodation or it's a skill that might actually need to be worked on as an objective, because it's not going to be something that can be accommodated post high school. And I think also just the accommodations, like those are IEP accommodations, but there's also all the accommodating we do, for students throughout the day. And so I always encourage people think about going home, going back to school, doing one thing differently tomorrow, right? Is it learning to set an alarm to prompt something specific, like getting up in the morning or making a transition? Is it reducing a reminder to do homework or to take medication or to get started with something, setting a table, heating up a meal, right? Just minimizing one prompt somewhere in the day can make a big difference. And I did mention automaticity, but again, I think it's just, making sure that students are really building the ability to do things without occupying their mind with a low level details requirement. With the low level details required, right? So it's like they don't have to think about what they're doing. I don't have to really like talk myself through brushing my teeth. I need to pay a little bit of attention, but I can think through other activities while I'm doing that, right? We want to become so automatic with certain things that they don't take up brain space so that we are ready to use that brain space for the new and more challenging activities that we need to take on in adulthood. And I think, it's not enough to be able to do skills like 80% of the time with 1 to 2 prompts. If they're important skills, they really need to be automatic. Also, once a skill's automatic, take it on the road, right? If a student's learned to use a debit card machine at Walmart, what about Target, right? I try to think about like, can a student order something in at least like 5 restaurants, right? Like just really thinking about functional skills and being able to use those skills in a lot of different settings. And we talked about this a little bit, really rethinking what a team looks like. So students need lasting teams, not just IEP teams. These are a number of relationship-based supports. Some are eligibility specific, but who are the family members that can really be part of the student's team long-term? Friends, family friends, dating relationships, familiar people in the community. If you want a student to be safe in life, you want them to be the mayor of the community they live in. You want them to know everybody. Right? Like that's what's important. Roommates can be part, sort of supports, coworkers, people with shared interests and hobbies. Certainly there are these adult service providers, but those shouldn't be the people that we're depending on as team members long term. It needs to be bigger than that. And I sort of said this already, but safety is really about having authentic relationships with non-disabled people in the community, or just a large number of people in the community. That makes a big difference for students. And make sure to plan ahead for transportation. Transportation appears for school-aged kids and then disappears when we are done with school. And if you can't get somewhere, you can't have it, right? So if a student's going to be a driver, we need to think about the fact that getting a license is not the same as being able to use it. Students need to know what to do if they're pulled over, if they're in a fender bender, if they have a flat tire, if they're at a four-way stop. I think having driven for however many years I've driven, right, and driving in Boston and other things, like fender benders do happen. And I feel like my brain freezes every single time. And then, if I'm prone to crying in those situations, but some students might be prone to other behaviors. Like you need to have a plan for how a student's going to react, because that's part of driving, is getting into these sticky situations. Also needing to take, time to plan routes, leaving time to reduce stress or reduce speeding, thinking about whether to listen to music or not, what to do with the phone. There's a lot that should be planned for if somebody's going to be driving around. And then many students might need to learn to use public transportation or even paratransit or ADA transportation, which also requires executive function and social and safety skills. So it takes a long time to plan to be able to get places on your own as an adult. And I like to mention, don't forget technology and assistive technology. I think technology is one of these amazing things, and it can be low technology, right? But technology is one of the things in life that allows us to go from being prompted by other people to using a self-accommodation, and sometimes to getting something, getting a need met that we might not otherwise get met. It can be, alarm clock, right? And there's a million different alarm clocks, figuring out the one that works for the student. Our phones, our phones are amazing technology, but boy, can they be distractors. So figuring out the most functional way, for that to work for the student. And then there are just so many other things, smartwatches for helping with like health or motivation or reminders. For academics, it can be things like speech to text and text to speech and spell checking and picture dictionaries and text magnification, tools for test taking, writing, note taking, reference, graphic organizers, draft builders, assistive listening for auditory processing, proofreading software, math tools, geolocation reminders, even things like Instacart and then like PillPack, right? Like we have so many online services that can help to really create more independence. So I'm going to share a couple of resource slides here, and then I'm actually going to move on to questions because I'm through the majority of the content. So if you're attending the presentation tonight and you signed up, we will make sure to email out copies of the slides, so you'll get some of the slides that have these different resources. This page here is Massachusetts specific. These are some other, sort of more global tools in terms of thinking about transition planning. Charting the life course is really in some ways a movement, but has some wonderful tools for thinking about visioning for the future. For students, for families. There's a lot of great information that comes out of the National Secondary Transition Technical Assistance Center and Division on Career Development and Transition that I mentioned. And then these are just some of the more technical resources that I used for the presentation. This is the contact information for NESCA. One of the things I'd like to highlight here is that NESCA has a blog, NESCA Notes, and every single clinician at NESCA contributes to this, myself included. I contribute pretty frequently. And when I blog, I just write about anything that I've had to explain to family. If I've had to explain it to 3 families, I often write a blog about it. And I say had to explain it, but what I mean is like, there are so many questions and challenges and, confusion. Like everything about transition planning is novel. Students have been doing school for long periods of time. And, in some ways school is like a linear kind of a thing, right? Or it's a narrow kind of a thing. School looks pretty similar for a lot of different kids. But when we think about planning for adult post-secondary life, we're planning for an unlimited number of options for an unlimited number of kids. And so it's much more complicated, right? Like there's different resources that are going to be important for each student that we're transition planning for. And so I find it, helpful to just kind of write things down when there's information that seems to be needed by multiple families. So I do strongly recommend that blog. And then let's start to look at some of these questions. So feel free to add in other questions to the chat as we go, but I'm going to start to take some of the questions that are already sitting in the chat. So there's a question that actually has to do with assessment here. You know, is it critical to have neuropsychological evaluation done at the same time as a transition assessment? And there's so many, there's a lot of pieces that can be unpacked in that question. And I know we have some attendees who aren't even just from Massachusetts, but I think, you know, in special education, you know, you go through an eligibility process that includes evaluation across different areas of functioning, you know, across the different areas of suspected disability for the student. And then there's a requirement that you go through re-eligibility every 3 years. There's actually nothing that prevents assessment from happening sooner than 3 years, but that's about the cadence that we do the different evaluations. And so there can be sort of a myth that like neuropsychological evaluation, which is when you typically go see a private neuropsychologist for testing, there can be a little bit of a myth that neuropsychological evaluation is like good for 3 years because we think about this triennial evaluation thing. And so we just think, okay, all tests are good for 3 years and we do testing every 3 years. And that's not really the case. Neuropsychological evaluation, you know, there are certain tests that can't be repeated within 6 months or within 12 months of having been done. But, you know, sometimes there's reasons you go through that more often than every 3 years. And sometimes there's reasons you go through that less often. And it has a lot to do with whether the student might have changed and there might be new information that you need to explore, or whether you need that type of comprehensive testing to inform the team because the team's trying to make some sort of new decision, right? So neuropsychological evaluation often looks at cognition and academics. Well, actually, academics is educational testing. And so sometimes that's an additional component. Not every neuropsych will do that. But it looks at cognition and learning and memory, and often sometimes social emotional functioning. And then also academics, depending on whether you've sort of organized to have that be part of that. All of those things are certainly part of transition assessment, right? You know, sort of what the student's needs are, how the student learns, how they remember things, how they're doing academically, how they're doing socially and emotionally. All of that is data that informs transition planning, right? But transition assessment often looks at some things that go beyond that, because the purpose of transition assessment is figuring out what the student's post-secondary goals are. So I have to do enough testing as part of transition assessment that I have the ability to answer what the student is hoping to do after high school, or what are reasonable goals for this student after high school. A lot of times transition assessment is going to have, you know, dig into employment in a way that neuropsych has not, right? I might look at career interests, career aptitudes, career preferences, you know, work personality style, things like that. I may dig in more to life skills, get a much better sense of, you know, not just scores for the student's adaptive functioning, but starting points for working on certain independent living skills for the student. And if a student's thinking of transitioning to post-secondary learning or a training environment, I'm probably going to look at, you know, other things as far as like college and career planning skills. Self-determination is going to be something that's often evaluated as part of transition assessment that maybe hasn't been looked at as part of neuropsychological evaluation. And so there's a lot of different variables between a neuropsychological evaluation and between a transition assessment that we would then put together, you know, to be able to create appropriate specialized instruction for a student and an appropriate transition plan for a student. And so there's nothing that says you have to do a neuropsychological evaluation and a transition assessment at the same time, or that you even have to do neuropsychological, you know, like evaluation like every 3 years. It's so dependent on the student and what we need to know. If we need to know more about diagnosis or learning or be able to help inform a team process around what a student needs, because we're not sure if they're getting their needs met with their current school program. That's definitely something that you seek neuropsychological evaluation. If we're trying to make sure we have a really good sense of the student's post-secondary goals and that we have the best transition services in place for the student, that's often when we're thinking about transition assessment. And what's interesting about transition assessment is that the way the federal law is written, the student's IEP needs to be updated annually, and the measurable post-secondary goals have to be updated annually. And those measurable post-secondary goals have to be updated based on age-appropriate transition assessment. So really, we should be documenting some form of transition assessment every single year after a student has reached transition aged. And it's not even just, let's say in Massachusetts, we start transition planning at age 14. That means the IEP that's already been written, that's in effect when the student turns 14, has to have measurable post-secondary goals for that student and appropriate transition services for that student. So we will have needed some sort of transition assessment really when the student was 13 to inform that planning process. And then we need to keep having ways to do assessment over time every single year to be able to inform those goals and those transition services. There was also a question, this is sort of a NESCA specific question, asking, if you were somebody who was interested in having transition assessment done at NESCA, would you need to also have neuropsychological evaluation done at NESCA? And you do not. There's no requirement at NESCA that if you're having one service done with us, you need to have another service done with us. So, some families have neuropsychological evaluations done at NESCA, and transition assessments are done by their school district or by a collaborative. Some students have neuropsychological evaluations done elsewhere and transition assessments done at NESCA. And the other thing that's often not well known about us as service providers is you don't just have to come to us for evaluations. We do consultation. We'll do transition consultations if you've had other transition assessments done and you want to have a sense of ways that it's sort of meeting the students' needs, or if, let's say, we had some transition assessment last year and team's getting ready to do some more assessment this year, and you want to make sure that we're getting the information that's needed and we're wondering what might be missing, we absolutely provide consultation. We'll be part of teams even if we haven't done even if we didn't do the transition assessments for the students. So we're really happy to help with transition planning in any way that's most effective and supportive for students. So I need to click over that I've answered a couple of these questions. There's a question, because we're talking about assessment, I'll take this question. It's a question that says, do I recommend any specific assessments for transition assessment? And I have certainly written some blogs about types of transition assessment. I think the reality is there are an infinite number of types of, assessment tools that could be used for transition assessment. If you Google it, like transition assessment planning tool, literally, put in quotes, transition assessment planning tool. You should get a tool on the internet that'll tell you different areas to cover in transition assessment. And that's great to make sure you've covered like different areas of transition planning. But you can also find transition assessment databases on the internet. I personally like the transition planning inventory 3 or 2. They're the same exact test. It's a 57-item questionnaire that parents, students, and teachers can answer. It has a modified format for students who are going to need support with different things throughout life. And so it's quick, right? The thing to know about that tool is the team's supposed to go through the answers to all 57 of those items together, right? We're not supposed to aggregate, not supposed to just like take take all 7 self-determination items and average them together, because knowing whether a student's able to talk about their strengths versus whether they know anything about their disability rights or the law, like those are really different pieces of information. So I think it's a really quick tool to administer, and then it's important to kind of actually have a meaningful way to use the results of that. I think adaptive functioning questionnaires like the ABAS or the Vineland, those are really important. It's important to make sure life skills have been measured, right? For students who are thinking about college readiness, I like the Landmark. It's Landmark. I don't know if it's questionnaire for college readiness or what it is, but there are a lot of different tools. So it's not just one tool, it's really looking at whether things are across areas. For self-determination tools, the Zero Center has tons of free self-determination assessments with manuals. Those are a lot of the different areas that I like to make sure get covered for students. And then, Brigance has good stuff. For students have really high support needs, things like the assessment of functional living skills that really break, like there are assessment tools that break very small, very small skills down, into like 27 pieces. And really get at like where learning needs to start for students. And some of those are really important for students who need like very explicit instructional methodologies. So hopefully that's helpful in terms of thinking about some of the assessment tools. And then there's a really important question here that asks about a 688 referral, which is a Massachusetts process. So in the state of Massachusetts, when students are sort of getting close to the point when they're going to exit public education. So they're either 2 years before they're going to get their high school diploma, or they're 2 years before they're going to age out of special education services. There's something called a 688 referral. And what that actually is a referral that's supposed to be made by the school district, by the local educational agency, to an adult human service agency who is going to, in some ways, take some level of responsibility for that student when they exit public education. And what the 688 referral actually does is it sort of indicates to the state of Massachusetts, here's a student who's had special education services and who is going to need some supports from adult human services when they exit. And so what it's actually doing is triggering a note to the state of Massachusetts that they're going to need to have funding for this kid 2 years down the line. So I think it's really important to make sure that those 688 referrals happen 2 years before the student exits public education. In order to do that, it's really nice to start talking to families before that, right? If when we're starting the transition planning process in middle school, or early in high school, if we're a little behind, we talk about the fact that part of transition planning is going to involve bringing adult service agencies in to be part of the team. It's not that we're just handing off a kid to adult service agencies, it's that we're going to start bringing adult service agencies in to be part of the team, in to get to know the student, in to help be able to think about planning for the student when they no longer have special education services. So I think it's really important to talk to families more than 2 years before a student exits, because you want to be able to make that referral right on time at the 2-year mark. And then, there are various reasons that a 688 referral might go through smoothly or not go through smoothly. But I think we always want to do our part. If we're working in the school district or with the school district, we always want to do our part to get it to the state agencies on time, and then to follow up on that, pretty actively, because it's just so important that the state is budgeting appropriately. We're having some real challenges right now with students exiting public education and like not having not having funding or not having service providers available for a little bit of time. And then when there's a gap, there can be skill regression. And nobody wants that when students are working so hard and families are working so hard and educators are working so hard to make sure that the students are building skills. So it says 2 questions. When do you talk to parents about a 688, but I don't know if there's another question. If there's another question, feel free to type that in. And then there's another very specific question here that has to do with getting maximum support when, I think, when a student transitions from public education to support from the Department of Developmental Services. And it's really tricky. There are not like perfect criteria for knowing exactly how much support or what types of support a student is going to qualify for when they exit public education. One of the conversations that I have been having a lot with several families in the last 2 weeks is just really understanding that the criteria for students to be able to have residential special education programming in some states is quite different than the criteria for being able to have residential support after you exit public education. They're not the same laws. They're not the same systems. They're not the same budget lines. And so there are students who are participating in schools and have been participating in schools for long periods of time, who have been residential participants in educational programs, institutions, who will, exit out either because they've taken a diploma or exit out because they're aging out of special education, and they may not meet the qualification criteria for adult human services to provide a residence for them. Or they might not have the skills to actually be able to be part of certain residents, right? And so that's why that last question about when to do the 688 referral, when to start, if you're not in Massachusetts, just like when to start talking with developmental services about, and involving them as part of your IEP team about the student exiting public education is as early as the agency will talk with you, right? As as early as they'll make a decision, as early as they'll start letting you know how much funding you qualify for, because you really there's such a small percentage of students that will actually qualify for residential support. It is often much more likely that families are going to have to figure out that support. And so if you happen to know that your child's not going to be successful coming back home, that means there has to be a plan for funding a residence other than your home. And that's not always possible. So it's certainly something that needs to be discussed and needs to be understood, and good research needs to be done on developmental services in your state. And you want to involve, coordinators from there in your planning process as early as possible to really know how much support you can expect, and to make a thoughtful plan. And then there are other resources, other funding sources that can be supportive of housing. And it takes a lot of time and a lot of application processes and a lot of patience to get all of those in place. So it's something to really be thinking about as part of the transition planning process. And I think that I have answered all of the questions that were put in the chat so far. Does anybody else have any additional questions that you want to make sure get answered this evening? All right, well, I really appreciate all of the time that each of you have put into coming to this presentation tonight. I know we covered a lot of different content. I'm hopeful that you're leaving with a plan and a thought of something that you might be able to do, differently tomorrow, some prompt that you might not give, um, just to give an increment more of independence and responsibility. And we will definitely share these slides out, um, hopefully tomorrow, with all the attendees. And then, certainly if you have follow-up questions, please feel free to send those to us, or if you want to set up any sort of consultation or other things to talk more about individual situations, we're always open to that. So thank you so much for your time this evening, and I hope everybody has a wonderful night.